Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we are going to talk Fusion 360 for Origin. Noah's going to lead us through a couple cool examples and projects and kind of, everything you need from getting started to using Fusion for really powerful projects with Origin.
So we're just going to, as we do in sessions, go through some slides quickly before we dive in. But most of the time will be spent taking a look at my computer's desktop so we can run through some good practical intro to Fusion basics. I want you to come at it today with a really kind of good basic knowledge that you can tinker around with. Fusion is an amazing tool, a little bit maybe daunting to get started with, but the good news is it's free to hobbyists, and you can download it on Mac or PC, whatever, and just get tinkering with it. So there's really no reason to not be playing with it today. Well, let's dive right in. As I said, Fusion 360, and specifically for Origin, but there's one thing that really makes it specific to Origin, and that's the plugin. We'll talk about that in a bit. But today we're going to go over a couple of projects. So we're going to look at a little simple mortise and tenon three-legged stool and a little bookcase. There are really kind of two sides to 3D modeling, if you really boil it down to the basics. And it's not really all that different from how traditional fabrication has been for years and years and years and years. You have your sketching and your drawings, and then you work off of those drawings to create 3D objects and, figure out how they relate to one another, work together, interface into, mortise and tenons or dados or whatever. You're going to draw those out, and then you're going to make them in real life using, cutting operations and the like. So in sketching, the three kind of important things we're going to go over today: lines, arcs, and circles, so just kind of basic geometry. Dimensioning. So the cool thing about solid modeling as opposed to kind of other types of modeling is it's a very dimension-heavy sort of sketching, which is something I like. I think it makes a lot of sense to me because once you make a line or a circle or an arc a particular dimension, it does not change until you open up that dimension and change it. So it's going to stay that way. And the last item in sketching that we'll look at is constraints. And constraints there's quite a few of them in Fusion, so it can feel a little bit scary to open that menu up. But the basic idea here is like high school geometry. So coincident, parallel, perpendicular, horizontal, vertical. These are all behaviors that you'll be able to assign to lines, arcs, and circles, and points at the ends of those lines and arcs. And those are sort of like dimensions. They're perpetual unless you change them. And so it's kind of nice because once you've set something up, it stays that way, and you can kind of trust that it's going to stay that way. So moving into 3D operations, after you have your sketch together, you'll probably be familiar, but like extruding in 3D. So that's sort of creating shapes from the profiles that you've made in your sketches. You can extrude and cut with profiles, and you can do that on an object. So you can extrude an object, and then say you wanted to make a tenon that's perpendicular to that object. You can then cut that tenon's profile hole. So that's kind of how that works. We'll take a look at all this. Patterning, which is really powerful if you've got kind of items that repeat in your model. So you don't have to draw or extrude every single one of them. You can just do one and make a circular or rectangular pattern. And then combine, which is how you sort of make two objects into one object, or make two objects interface with each other somehow. And we'll get into that actually with the stool model. So what makes this kind of more specifically about Origin and not just Fusion today is that we actually have an amazing plugin for Fusion, and we call that Shaper Utilities. It is available for free in the Autodesk App Store. So as it says, apps.autodesk.com, and search for Shaper Utilities. Go ahead and download that for either Mac or Windows. Get that installed. And once that's installed in Fusion and running, this is what you're going to see when you run it. So it's actually going to be under the Tools tab. So normally when you're kind of in the default model, you're going to be in the Solid tab. So that's above that little Shaper logo, you'll see Solid. So if you don't see the Shaper Utilities button, it's probably because either you haven't installed it, but if you have installed it, it's because you're not in the Tools tab. We'll go over that again. We're kind of briefly covering all the things I want to talk about today. Rendering and visualization. So one thing I find really, really sort of helpful and differentiating about Fusion and solid modeling in general is that it allows me to see my designs in full 3D and see exactly how they're going to relate to one another. And this is a stool project from our on-tool CAD joinery session. So take a look at that if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about this stool. But the basic idea here is on the left side of the screen, that's a sort of wood textured rendering that Fusion produced. Really easy to do that. We'll look at how to do that, but it's really actually quite straightforward to make really nice looking wood project renderings. On the right hand side is a section view that you can use to sort of analyze how your project is going to all go together and get an idea of a little bit more, for lack of a better word, the inner workings of your joinery so that you can understand and make sure that it's all right. So then the last thing that we're going to talk about on the next slide, parameters. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on them because it is a sort of Pandora's box if we open that up. But Fusion has the ability to define parameter values, and then those can be referenced in your model. And it allows you to make some really powerful models that are responsive to changes in material thickness, changes in dimension, and just kind of allows you to be really flexible once you have the model built. So we'll take a look at that quickly at the end. I guess we'll just go ahead and dive right in. So here we are, and I have this stool complete, but we're going to actually start from zero. I just wanted to quickly show you kind of what we're working at here. I've got a plugin running here that shows my keystrokes. So keep an eye on that if you're kind of wondering what's going on in the background. But I'm just orbiting around this model right now by holding down the shift key and my middle mouse button, the scroll wheel button. And that's how we orbit around this model. Actually, just go ahead and create a new document, but this is what we're aiming at, just to give you guys an idea. So we're going to go to File, New Design, and we'll just go ahead and save that as Stool Demo Fusion. So that's saved. Always good to keep your models saved, though Fusion does do a good job of kind of saving backups in case your computer crashes or Fusion crashes. So keep an eye out for that. If the worst happens, chances are you won't lose everything. So the first thing that we're going to do, like I said in that building block slide, is we're going to create a sketch. And so this is very similar to table drafting. If you guys are familiar at all with table drafting or, orthographic sketching, whatever you do to kind of get your ideas out of your head and onto paper, in this case, onto a screen, we're going to do more or less the same thing. So we want to set up a couple sort of things to define our reality. And actually the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and turn on the origin. And I know this is confusing in that the router is called origin, but this origin is actually the sort of 0, 0, 0 point of this drawing. So it's the point from which we're going to base all of our dimensions. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this point, we're going to call this guy the bottom of the seat of the stool. So first thing that we're going to do is just go ahead and create the profile. So we're going to select this top plane. If you didn't see what happened there, when you create a sketch, you have to select the plane that you want to be sketching on. So we're just going to select this plane, which is the top. We're going to go back around to the top here. Click on the view cube to recenter ourselves. So now we're in the sketching mode. You'll notice the tool set has changed on the top. And the first thing that we want to do is create a circle, because we're making a circular top. So I'm going to grab this center point circle, and the first thing you do is define the center point, and we want that to be at that 0, 0 point. So click, and then you can see actually that we're dragging out, and there's this dimension. It's populating right now, and it's in millimeters. So what I'm going to do actually quickly here is go ahead and change this whole document over to inches, because this stool is designed in inches. So we're going to change this to inch. And now, in order to define the top of the stool, we're going to go ahead and open up this Create menu and click on Sketch Dimension. The hotkey for that is D. So I'll probably be using that interchangeably out of habit, but hopefully you'll be able to see that with the keystroke. I'm going to go ahead and create the dimension, and you can see now that's about 3 inches. We want to make the top about 12 inches. So that makes it a little bigger. So now that's our top made, and actually we can finish this sketch. The top doesn't really need any more than just the circle. So we'll go ahead and finish this sketch. And now we're going to create the leg profile. So we're going to create another sketch. So again, under Create, we're going to click on the Create Sketch button. This time though, we're going to define this sketch on the left plane. So we're going to click on that plane. You can see up here, left. So the left plane. And now what we want to do is we're going to define quickly the height of our stool. So the way I like to do this is with construction lines, so we'll talk about that for a second. So a construction line is essentially like a guide for Origin. It's something that is there only for the sort of process, not the final product. So I've created this line, and to make it a construction line, I go over to my sketch palette and I click this button, construction. And you'll notice that the line goes from a solid line to a dashed line. So you'll know any dashed line in your model, that's a construction line, and it's going to behave a little differently. So, and we'll talk about that in a second, because it'll be sort of more obvious what those behaviors are as soon as we get a little bit more of the sketch done. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my sketch dimension tool again. So that's the letter D to open that. And I'm going to define this line. So I just click between the 2 points and click a third time to set it up. I'm going to define this as 11 inches. So that's the distance between the bottom of the stool and the ground. So that's 11 inches now. And now I am going to grab my line tool again. Actually, I'm going to be drawing on this side. So you can always grab the dimension line and kind of scoot it wherever you need it. If it's in the way, you can get it out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my line tool again. And again, I've been probably bad here. L is the line tool as well, but it's up here in the sketch menu. I have to keep stopping myself as I like to use the hotkeys. And actually, one thing that I didn't do, which is really important here, is I didn't bring in this other line, which is in fact our circular top, the first sketch we made. What we want to do, and this one's a little confusing, but hopefully you'll kind of grasp the idea a little bit. You can relate two sketches to each other, and you do that by going to Create, or maybe it's actually under, Modify. No? There it is, Project Include. It is under Create. So you're going to create a projected line, and so all that's doing essentially is taking one sketch and bringing it into another sketch. So I'm going to create a projected line of our circular sketch, right? And hit OK. And you'll notice because the sketch plane is actually perpendicular, so we've gone from the top plane to the right plane or left plane, it's just a line now. So that's basically because in this view, straight on, all you're seeing is a line. So that's maybe a little confusing, but hopefully you'll forgive me for that one. Project is a little bit of a funny one to get used to, but once you do, it's quite useful to know about. So I'm going to make that projected line a construction line. So quickly, just so I don't confuse it. Remember, this browser on the left-hand side is how you kind of hide and show stuff. So I'm going to hide that first sketch. So we're just seeing that projected line. And you'll notice the projected line comes in as purple. So it's a different color for projected lines. And we're going to make that construction as well. OK. Sorry, a little bit of a detour. So back to our leg profile. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my line tool. And I'm going to start by the bottom of my stool. And I'm going to click once, and I'm going to drag downwards. So, and then one thing that's actually kind of fun here is if I drag my mouse over a point, but don't click, and then drag outwards, you see that line that's drawing between the bottom point of my height line, my height construction line, and the bottom point of my leg profile. So that is an inferred sort of guide that Fusion trying to guess what you're doing. And in this case, it's really helpful because I do want that to be in line with the bottom, because this is the bottom of the leg where it will contact the ground. So we're going to click once. We're going to keep going though. So we're going to make the bottom of the leg, and that wants to be flat to the ground. And then we're going to click again, and we're going to drag back upwards. And that wants to be back in line with the bottom of the seat. So you'll notice there's kind of lots of little automatic inferences that Fusion tries to do. Some of them are helpful, some of them are not. So just look out for those. And sometimes it'll actually automatically generate constraints. So we talked about constraints a little bit earlier, and we're going to get into those in a second. Constraints are notated by all these little symbols. So each one of these symbols that's next to a line, here, 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 those are all constraints. So this is a perpendicular constraint, which means this line is perpendicular to this line. So in that case, that's OK. That's what we want. But sometimes that can be really annoying And so it's a good thing to just look and see if there's sort of any constraints that you didn't specifically put into your drawing if you're kind of having trouble, if you're trying to troubleshoot. And actually, one thing that happened here is because we were making so many construction lines, Fusion said, oh, well, you want that to be a construction line also. We don't. We want this to be a fully useful profile line for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this whole chain of lines. So one, and holding Shift, select, and select. Good trick for selecting lots of lines that are chained is actually if you just double click on one of them, it'll select all of them that are chained. But you can always, like I said, hold Shift and just select everything that you want to be working on. So now we're going to turn construction off. So those become solid lines again, which is good. That's what we want. So quickly, before we move on from this little bit, we're going to dimension up this leg. So again, create sketch dimension. And this sketch dimension tool is really powerful, and you can almost draw a dimension between anything, and it doesn't have to be a linear dimension either. In this case, we wanted to find the angle that this leg sits off of the center line of the stool. So I'm going to grab this center line, and I'm going to click on the leg, and because they're at an angle to one another, Fusion automatically says, oh, well, that's an angle dimension. So great, that's what we want, and we want that to be 16 degrees. There we go. And like I said, you can always drag those dimensions around. So now that that's 16 degrees, and what we're going to do here is grab the dimension tool one more time, and we're going to dimension the top of the stool. So the top where the leg meets the bottom of the stool, we want that to be 1.5 inches, so 1.5. And you can see this is sort of doing a little twisty bit here, but you can always drag that back out. Where the stool meets the floor, we'd like that to be 1 inch. So we're going to dimension that to 1 inch. And then the last thing that we need to do here is tell it where we want this guy to be hanging out. Oh, there's actually two things. So we didn't tell this that we want it to be along the bottom as well. So actually, let's take this, well, getting ahead of myself. So let's finish the dimensions here that we were going to do. So I'm going to grab my sketch dimension tool, again, T, and select this point and the edge of the stool top. We want that to be 2 inches so that the leg sits in 2 inches from the edge of the stool. Okay, so the last thing now that we need to define is this leg of the stool is actually, you can see it's not snapped to the ground. And we can do that in a few different ways, but I'll show you probably the simplest to understand. So we'll grab the line tool. We're going to click on the bottom of that center line, and we're going to click on the left bottom, the left bottom of the leg profile. And now we've made a line between the two of them. And that's a construction line, which is good. It, I think, automatically makes it one if it's touching another construction line. But this is not really doing anything more for us, right? The leg is still doing the same thing. However, if I go up to my constraints menu and I get this horizontal and vertical constraint tool, now you can see my mouse looks a little different. There's a little symbol to the right of it. Now if I click on that leg, it's gonna snap it to horizontal. And so that horizontal and vertical tool basically will snap a line to whichever is closest, either horizontal or vertical. So now this is all constrained, and you know that because the line has actually turned black rather than blue. So as soon as I put the sort of last nail in the coffin, as as they say, that's not going anywhere. So unless, like I said, unless you go and open up one of these dimensions and say I wanted to make this 1.25, it's not going to change unless I change it. So I like that. I like knowing that things aren't going to move around on me. So the one last thing we want to do here is actually we're not quite done. This is only the bottom of the stool, top, the seat rather. And so I'm going to grab my line tool and just finish this out here. It's just going to be a rectangle that goes up and comes straight back down. So again, we want to make that a regular profile line. And you can see there were some constraints inferred, these perpendicular constraints, which is good, but this last line is still undefined. So again, we want that to be vertical. So I'm just going to go ahead, click on my horizontal vertical tool, click on that guy. Now, the only thing that's open is the top, and we want that to be 1 inch because the top's going to be 1 inch thick. So dimension tool, and actually deselect. So anything that you select and then hit the dimension tool on, it's going to come up automatically to dimension that part. That's not what we want here. So make sure sometimes if that's happening to you that you just click anywhere in the window that isn't kind of a profile or line or any object that you're working with. We're going to make this 1 inch. And that's it. So now you'll notice that another thing has changed in the kind of color coding that Fusion does. There's a sort of blue shading inside of this profile, and when I hover over it, it gets even darker blue. Nothing else does that, right? And that's because the only closed shape, the only closed profile in this sketch is this leg profile. This is the magic of construction lines. If these lines were not construction, and I'll just change them to a regular line quickly so you can see, we would be getting this profile as well. And that's not something we want. So this is just an easy way to kind of eliminate confusion. We just make all these lines construction. And now Fusion says, oh, okay, so this profile is the only one you really want to extrude or do other operations to. So that's it. Built our sketches. And I know that was maybe a little bit time consuming, but that's kind of the deal here. You're setting up the groundwork. Sketches almost always take longer than the rest of the operations because you really have to sweat the details sometimes in these sketches. So that's okay. So we'll hit finish sketch. That's going to go ahead and save those changes for the moment. And then we're going to I'm just going to save this whole document. Good practice. And you'll notice one thing that's cool about Fusion 2 is that it tracks versions for you. And I won't get into that too much, but if you open up this little button here, you can actually look at previous versions that you've saved and even revert to those if you like them better, which is kind of neat. So I'm going to turn on my top sketch. So now you can see there's a little bit of a thing going on here. We're making a stool. It's starting to take shape. So next, obviously, we need to turn sketches into 3D objects, and we're going to do that with the extrude function. We're going to go ahead and go into create and extrude, which is the E key, and it's actually also up in this sort of top toolbar. So the first profile that we want to make is the top. Why not? So we're going to just select the profile. See, when I hover over it, it changes color, and I'm going to click on that profile. You can see now in this extrude panel, there is one profile selected. If you're not happy with that selection, remember, you can always unselect it. And you can select multiple profiles to extrude as long as they're in the same plane with one another. You can't extrude in 2 planes at once. Not physically possible. So, and this is, like I said, our stool top is going to be 1 inch thick. So I'm just going to type 1 in there. And now we have a solid thing. And the only other thing that I want to do here is just talk briefly about this little operation tab in the extrude dialog. This one's really important, and it can really trip you up sometimes. So let's spend a second talking about it. So the default is to create a new body, and that's good. This is a solid body. That's what it's called when it's extruded. However, if you were to extrude something after you've made a solid body and those 2 bodies were in contact with one another, the default for the extrusion is going to be a join operation. And that's going to combine the 2 bodies into one single body. Now, if that's something you want, that's great. But if it's something you don't want, it can be really confusing when you come back to it later and you've discovered sort of Fusion is making assumptions about what you're doing that you didn't realize. So this, again, this operation is really it'll trip you up sometimes. So just if you're having trouble and you don't know why things are one body, or rather the body number of bodies in your browser doesn't sort of match the number that you think you should see, it's probably because one of these extrude operations was set to join. So new body and new component are kind of almost the same thing. I like to use components, and it's a little bit confusing here to get into it, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new component, and I would encourage you to learn about Fusion components if you're interested in that. I'm not going to get into it today. Effectively, a component and a body are almost the same. There's some kind of critical differences for sort of how you manage your model if it gets more complicated. So new component, okay. And you'll notice down here, now we've created a new component, and we can name that. Double click on it to name it. We're going to call that top. And now we want to create our leg. And so actually, I'm going to go ahead and just quickly hide the top so that we can just be working on our leg, because we're going to take a little bit of time to work on the leg. And we're going to extrude the leg. So extrude and select the profile. And again, I'm going to make this a new component. Now the only difference here is that I actually want my leg to split the plane that it's on. Just by the nature of the three-legged stool, this is kind of what we want to do. And so the way we do that, instead of a one-sided extrusion, so this direction tab, we're going to do a symmetric extrusion. So what that's going to do, and actually, let me just show you what a one-sided, so we're going to make this a 1 inch. 1 inch. Okay, so you'll notice it's only going out on one side of the plane right now, but if I switch to a symmetric extrusion, now it's going out both sides. So it's, like I said, it's splitting that plane. And when you select symmetric, there's a few options. The most important one is this measurement button. So half length versus whole. We actually want the whole length, because we want the total thickness to be 1 inch. So Fusion is going to do the math to split the middle for you. In this case, simple math, but I'll take it. I like it when computers can do the math for me instead of me having to do it. So that's how we want it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And there we are. So we've got our leg. If I turn our top back on, you can see we have one leg and a top. Not quite a stool yet, but we're getting there. So I'm going to name this component leg. Always good to name things so that when you come back to them later, you know what's going on. But I'm going to hide the top again, just so that we can get a clearer view of what's going on here. And I'm actually going to zoom in on the top of this leg. And here's something that's kind of neat. Sketches don't necessarily have to go on those origin planes, okay? It's okay if the sketch goes on the top of the leg. So I'm going to create the sketch on top of this leg, and I'm going to make our tenon. So quickly here, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to create a rectangle that's the profile, and I'll show you why I'm doing that in our export for origin section here. And now I'm going to create the geometry for our tenon. So I'm going to get the line tool. And this is kind of a neat one here. I'm going to click once to start dragging a line upwards. And now, instead of just clicking again, I'm going to click and drag, and you'll notice that Fusion automatically makes an arc, which is pretty cool. So now I'm going to let go of my mouse button, drag again, click and drag again. Fusion's making that arc. And on round we go. So we're just making these round so that the tenon has got round profiles, so that when we make the matching mortise, we can cut that with a router. Obviously, we're going to have to be considerate about the router bit's diameter on how we size these radiuses. Okay, so a couple things. First thing is that neat sort of tool with, or trick with the line tool. It makes a tangent relationship, so again, a constraint between only the line that you started with, not the line that you ended with automatically. So I'm going to grab the tangent tool, and I'm going to click between the arc and this guy. You see it now adds a tangent relationship there, and between the arc and this line, again adding that little tangent symbol, and on, rinsing and repeating till we're happy. So now you can see all of those 4 arcs are tangent to the lines that surround them, which is good. So the only other thing that we want is all of these arcs to actually match in size. So I'm going to hold down Shift and select these 4 arcs. In this case, I can't use the double-click tool because I don't want to select everything, just the 4 arcs. And I'm going to click this equal button. And what that's going to do is make all 4 of those arcs equal to one another. So all I have to do actually is grab my dimension tool here, sketch dimension, click on one of those arcs, and define the radius. We'll define that as 1/8 of an inch. We're using a 1/4 inch router bit, so the radius will be 1/8. Now you can see they're all matched in size to that. And if I were to scale that up to say 1/4 inch, they would all be the same. So that equal relationship means that they'll all match each other in size, which is what we want in this case. So that's nice. So the only other thing we need to do is just make sure that this is centered in between edges of the top of my leg. And I'm just going to do that kind of the most straightforward way. I'm going to grab my dimension tool, and I'm going to make a make a line, or make a dimension here rather. We're going to call this 1/8 of an inch. And I'm actually just going to do that all the way around. So clicking between those two lines, 1/8 inch. Here, 1/8 inch. And the last one. And you'll notice these three sides have turned black because we've defined them. This one is still open and blue. So nice way to know that you've sort of done your job and fully defined all the lines in your sketch. So again, 1/8 inch. And that'll do it. That means we've got an even reveal for our shoulder all the way around. Okay, so we're going to finish up this sketch. And now we can grab the Extrude tool. And in this case, we're going to cut with the Extrude tool, which is a little confusing. Some solid modeling tools will have a separate tool for that guy, but Fusion uses Extrude to cut. But it's kind of smart about it. So if I just drag this arrow down, you'll see it starts to turn red when we're going to cut. So and we actually want to make it a -1 inch. And that'll make our tenon all the way through. So now we're starting to look rather stool-like here, or rather leg-like. Last thing we want to do just quickly, and this is an easy one, is create a fillet. And so that's under the Modify tab. I'm going to grab the fillet tool. And I could have used the fillet tool to make these rounds, but I will show you why I didn't in that particular case, and that's related to the export for origin. But I'm going to go ahead and select these 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to put a 1/4 inch radius on all of those guys. So now you can see those are nice and rounded over. So, okay, and that's our leg. So, last but not least, let's talk about patterns, because our leg needs more than one stool, or her stool needs more than one leg, rather. We're going to go ahead and go into this Create tab, and we're going to go to Pattern down here. And you can see there's a rectangular pattern, circular pattern along a path. This particular instance, we want the circular pattern because the top of the stool is circular. So we're going to grab that. And the pattern type is relating to what kind of object you want Fusion to pattern. In this case, it's a component because that leg is a component. Remember, we made it a component in the Extrude menu. So component. And then we're going to select this leg as the object. We need to select the axis. And that axis is going to be our center line of the stool. So we're going to select this axis. And already quantity is 3, but I could make it as many as I want. I'm going to do 3. And this little suppress box, what that's doing is it's actually giving you option to suppress or remove one of these instances of the pattern. So in this case, we don't need it, but kind of an interesting one to know about. So now we have a stool. Look at that. So the very last thing we have to do here, and we'll quickly breeze on to the next little bit, is we're going to go to the Modify tab, and we're going to use a combine operation to do the mortise side in the stool top, because we have yet to cut those. We certainly could have drawn those in the sketch for the top, but I wanted to show you this combine operation, which is really useful. So combine. So the target body is the body in this case that we want to cut. So that'll be the top. And then the tool bodies are whatever objects we want to use to cut the top. So we're going to select all 3 of those, and we're going to change this operation to a cut. We're going to hit OK. So 2 things happened. Thing 1 is I forgot to check a box in the Combine tool to keep our tools. But you can see that made the exact right mortises in our top. So we'll just do one thing here, and this will actually be a good opportunity to show you how to get back in and edit your operations. So this timeline here in the bottom, which I haven't talked about, is going to keep track of all of your operations and in what order they were done. And in a lot of cases, order is really important in solid modeling and in Fusion, because you sort of can't do one without the other. Things become related to one another necessarily. In this case, you can't do this combine operation without creating the legs in the top first. Hopefully that makes sense. But if I want to edit the combine, I'll just double click on it. And if I check this box here that says keep tools, lo and behold, we've kept the legs, which is good. So I'm going to turn the origin off quickly, but that's about it. Only other thing we could do if we wanted to was throw a fillet. So that's going to be the hotkey F on the top. We make that 1/4 inch to match the legs. And there we have it. That's done. Now, exporting for origin. And I realize I'm talking a long time on this stool, but I'm going to just go ahead and keep going. Exporting for origin is really straightforward, but there are a couple things that we want to do to set this model up so that it's actually ready to be exported. This is just sort of thinking through how you're going to be building the stool, what the order of operations is going to be. And the first thing that we're going to do is we want to make our legs first so that you can fit them into the top and make sort of adjustments on fitment. Always make your tenon side first if you can possibly do that. The first thing you want to do is expose the sort of raw profile of the leg. So we're going to hide the top, and we'll go ahead and just hide legs 2 and 3. So we've got one that we're working with. And it doesn't really do me any good to have these radiuses and the tenon on here, because really what I want is the profile that I need to cut, because I'm going to cut the profile of the leg first, and then I'm going to flip it up vertically on the workstation to cut the tenon. So it's just sort of thinking through those steps. So what I'm going to do is find the fillet here that's driving the radiuses on the leg, and I'm going to right click on that, and there's a little button guy down at the bottom that says suppress features. So what that's going to do is it's like a light switch. We're going to just switch that feature off for the moment. It doesn't delete it. You can always come back and turn it back on. But in this case, now we actually see the profile of the leg, which is good. We're not quite there. We also want to suppress the extrude for the tenon. So we're going to do that. So now what we're looking at here is just the straight up raw profile of the leg that we're creating, which is good. That's what we want to export. So we're going to go, like I said, to Tools up here. So it's from Solid to Tools. Click on this here Shaper button, and that's the Export to Origin. And you'll notice I have this little Advanced button checked, and that's actually something we're going to need in a second. So I pretty much always keep that checked, and I can then open up this input type. And in this case, I just want single solid body, because all we want is this leg profile, which is a single solid body. So we're going to select that guy, hit OK, and it's going to bring us into this output, and we're going to call this leg, and we're going to save it. So now that's saved in our folder. We're going to move on to the next thing that we need, which is going to be the top profile. So we'll go ahead and hide the leg for a second, open up this top, and again, we don't want the fillets. We just want that raw profile again. Oh, and actually here, so this is a little bit of a fun one. Because I suppressed the extrude feature to get that nice profile on my leg, these are now square. You see that we don't have the right thing going on there. So if I unsuppress, we're not back. Why are we not back? What's going on here? Unsuppress that guy. Why is that not updating? So I think, let's see. So sometimes Fusion can get a little confused. So what I did there to fix that is open up the combine menu and hit OK. So it's just sometimes it won't update unless you force it to. So now we're back. This is the profile that we want. And again, export to origin, select my solid body, hit OK, name it. So I'm going to name this guy top. Okay. And the last thing that we need to do is get our profile for our tenon. So I'm going to hide the top, show the leg again. But in this case, it's a little tricky to get exactly what you need out, because the profile for the tenon is related to the size of the leg, and you need to be able to sort of place that nicely. So, but there is a good trick that I want to show you. So if I open up the tab for this leg, ooh, actually it ended up here. Okay, so this sketch number 3 is what we're interested in. And if I go to Export for Origin and go to Input Type Entire Sketch, and I select the sketch that we used to create the tenon, I can actually just export that whole sketch. And so that's going to give me really good stuff here. And that's the reason why I included the radiuses in the sketch rather than making them a fillet afterwards. Because if I take this out now, what's going to end up landing on origin is this exterior line, which I can use as a guide, and this interior line, which is going to be my profile. So that's a really handy trick. You can export the entire sketch if you're trying to sort of get some construction geometry out of Fusion and make that useful for origin. You won't necessarily be getting that if you just export the body. So we'll go ahead and click OK. We're going to name this guy Tenon Profile. And we're good. So we've got all three of the items that we need, and we've got those saved to our computer. But now we want to go ahead and get those up on ShaperHub so we can make those useful to everybody. Or rather, well, you could make them useful to everybody on ShaperHub. You could share it as a project, or you can keep it all for yourself. That's your choice. So we're going to go ahead and scooch over to my ShaperHub origin files and go click here to upload. And we're going to select all three of these guys, the leg, the top, and the tenon profile. And we're going to upload those to ShaperHub. So now we've got our project saved to ShaperHub. And we'll be able to open that right up on Origin when we're ready to get into the shop. So, and the one thing that's a little strange about the tenon profiles is those aren't going to come in color-coded correctly because it's going to export the entire sketch, I believe, as an online. Not exactly sure how it's going to do that, but the good news is that Origin allows you to change the cut type at any point. So when you open the tenon profile, what you're going to want to do is get it placed down and then change the exterior line to a guide and the interior line to an outside cut. So that would be how you would do this without taking that tenon profile through another editing tool. So that's really what I'm wanting to show you here, is that most of the time you really don't need, say, Illustrator or Affinity to tune up your designs after the fact. You can pretty much get what you need out of Fusion. That was a lot. So a couple things I want to show you, and it may be that I don't show a full build of the bookshelf, but I just show you the parameters on that guy. And the bookshelf build is, I would say, fairly straightforward, just in the same vein here. Sketches and extrusions is pretty straightforward. A couple things I want to cover. First one is that visualization. Let's go ahead and look at Inspect first, because I think that's really interesting. So Inspect has kind of a suite of tools here, a lot of which are kind of over my head, that are more sort of mechanical engineering analysis, finite materials, and looking at how your parts will fail, that kind of thing. Can be really useful if you get your eye in on it, but what we're looking at is section analysis here, okay? And one thing actually I wanted to mention is, and this is really handy because I forget where everything is, if you hit the S key on your keyboard, it's actually going to bring up this search box, and I can search for anything I want. So if I want to create a section analysis, I start typing section, and you can see the first thing to pop up is section analysis. So that S key, invaluable. I use it all the time. I pretty much don't know where anything is in any of the menus, as I'm sure you've all noticed me struggling to find stuff. So section analysis, it wants to select a face. So we're going to look at one of these legs. So we'll select the leg, and then you can drag. It's sort of too much. We want to do like minus 0.5. Yeah. So you can tell it how much you want it to sort of subtract. And now I can take a look at everything that's going on inside of that joint. You know, in the case of the one on the slide, it was a little more complex, so it was kind of cool. But really good still to see here that your parts are fitting together perfectly and everything's sort of working how you want it to. And what's nice about this analysis is actually when you make one, it shows up in the browser on the left-hand side, and you can just turn it off. Or you can open this tab. You can see we have this section number 1. You can even name that, I think. Maybe not. There we go. Leg. So you can just keep noodling on your model and then, check to make sure that nothing's changed. Section analysis, really useful. Okay, so the next part of visualization is kind of just more for fun. So we're going to go ahead and just unsuppress our fillets here so that everything looks as it should. And then we're going to go over here to the left-hand side of your toolbar and click on Design. And we're going to go down to render. So we're changing the tool set to the rendering tool set. You'll notice sort of things change on us here. So first things first is we're not making a stool out of unknown black material, mystery material. We want to make it out of wood. And so what we want to do is set up the appearance here. And so we're going to go into the setup menu and click appearance. That's the A key is the shortcut. And we can actually look down here in this library, search for wood. And you can see there's a bunch of really cool wood profile, or wood textures rather, that Fusion comes with by default. And you can download these guys. I don't know if there is some restriction on the basic access, the free access to these guys, but you'll at least have some of them to play with. So these 3D wood textures are pretty amazing as far as rendering goes. So if I say, grab this 3D maple unfinished, I'm going to add it to my design, drag it up from the library and into this design section, and then literally drag and drop. I'm going to drag that guy out, and I'm going to drag it onto the legs. You can see because that's a pattern, it applied to all 3 of them at once, and onto the top. So in the 3D wood is amazing because it is sensitive to grain direction and shows end grain and does a lot that a lot of other rendering tools don't do with wood. So that's pretty powerful. You can even see like a little bit of end grain going on the top of the tenon. So, not all that like useful to your everyday life necessarily, but it's really cool to be able to kind of see how your designs look in the material that you're making them in. So, and then when we're happy with that, we can actually do 2 things. We can click on this render button, which is going to create a sort of high quality version of what you see on your screen, or we can actually just do this in canvas render. So I'll click on that. You guys can sort of see it happen in real time. So what this is doing is taking all of that information about the lighting that we set up in the room. And by the way, you can go into this sort of scene settings here and change the way your scene is lit. And it's just doing progressive passes and polishing out. You can see over here, it's going to go till it's at excellent quality in the in-canvas render. And you can always save that. Or like I said, you can have it do this in the background, but it's just sort of fun to see the magic happen while you're watching. And if I rotate, it's going to have to start over because it's a new view. But pretty neat stuff and cool to be able to sort of have a really good idea of what your project's going to look like even before you've set foot in the shop. So that is rendering. We can go back into the design view. And here we are back in the design. You can see it does bring the wood texture into the design view, but it's not rendering currently. So this is just the kind of regular canvas view. So that is that. So I'm just going to go ahead and open this bookshelf file that I have pre-made and just describe what a parameterized model means. So parameters are essentially variables. They're values that you can assign to a particular, essentially, name. So if I open up this sketch, so double clicking on my sketch, you can see it really doesn't look that different, but the dimensions all have this little fx next to them. And when I open this up, you can see it's not, in fact, the dimension typed in there, but a variable name, so material thickness in this case. Same over here. This is also material thickness. And then this guy, this 4 inches, is the shelf offset top. So those are all parameter names that I've set up in this model, and I'll show you how you can do that. But I wanted to show you that you can, instead of just making this a regular sort of numeric value, you can make this a parameter. Same for the height of this whole thing. Oops. Same for the height of this whole thing. Total height is that value. So if I go into modify, which is where the change parameters menu lives, and by the way, just quickly, this little 3-button menu on the menu bar drop down will allow you to pin certain things to toolbars. So that's kind of handy if you're going to use the parameters a lot. So if I click on this change parameters, basically this is just like a table of all of the parameters that I want in this model. And you'll notice that most of them are expressed in just single values, but you can also create equations in this expression and use other parameters to define a parameter, which can get quite powerful. So in this case, the shelf spacing is set up so that when I change, for instance, the total height, or if I change the offset at the top or the bottom, the shelf spacing will update and it will always be even, no matter how many shelves I specify. Obviously the shelf count as well. And the only other thing to mention here when you're creating parameters, and we'll go ahead and just make one. We'll call this demo parameter, is that you can change what the unit type is for this parameter. So if I open up this menu, you can see it's massive and very overwhelming. Don't worry about that. Mostly what you want is length, oftentimes angle, or no units. So obviously length is fairly self-explanatory, as is angles, but no units is really valuable. We'll just make this, well, we don't need to save this one actually. So, but you would say, like, if your demo parameter wanted to be 1.25 inches, you would put that in the expression field. Or you can do something like material thickness plus 2. And you can see now the value is the outcome of that equation. So we're going to cancel out of that guy because we don't want it. But in this case, shelf count actually doesn't have a unit. That's that no unit setting. And that's because it's just a straight up counted value. And we're going to use that in the pattern for this as the number of instances in that pattern. So we don't want it to be inches or degrees, right? We just want it to be 4 because there are 4 instances of the shelf. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK on the parameters for a second, close us out of the sketch, get us back into the 3D view, and just try and make the screen a little bigger here so that we can see both at the same time. So you can see that change parameters wasn't sticky to that menu. I put it in the sketch menu, not in the regular design menu, so it didn't stick. But anyway, we're here. So now, right now, our bookshelf is 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall. It is, let's see, where's the total depth? The upright. So I'm calling these components the left hand and right hand components upright. So the upright depth is 16 inches. So the total shelf depth is 16. The actual shelves, these guys in the center, those are 14. So they're set up to be in the center of the upright and set back 1 inch on either end. Now, that's all fine and dandy if that was my intent from the outset. But what if I didn't know what size bookshelf I wanted to make or how many shelves I wanted, and I wanted to be able to play with that? Now parameters become really powerful. So say I want to make this 6 foot by 8 foot bookshelf. Well, that's really easy. I just double click on this value. I'm going to make it 6 foot, and watch, it's going to update. Now it's wider. And now I'm going to make this 8 foot. And again, watch, it's going to update. Now it's taller. And you can see, because I have this shelf spacing set up as a function of these other parameters, like I said, they're going to stay even. Now, that's kind of a funky looking bookshelf, so I want to add a couple more shelves to that. So instead of 4 shelves, let's make this 6 shelves. And watch it update. So now, 6 evenly spaced shelves. Now, what if I wanted the bottom shelf to actually sit up a little higher? So that's that bottom, a shelf offset bottom. So if I wanted that to be, say, 12 inches instead of 4 inches. Now you can see the bottom shelf moves up to 12 inches from the ground, and all of the other shelves populate evenly all the way up to the top. And same if I wanted to make the shelf offset of the top 12 inches, they would all sort of squish down to make room for each other to stay even. So how is this useful beyond kind of party trick? Good question. Where I find parameters to be absolutely indispensable is when I am working with material thicknesses. So what I find to be the case is that I don't generally know what the exact caliper measured material thickness is going to be when I start a project out, because I'm at my desk rather than in the shop, and I don't want to necessarily have to know that, and I also want my model to be kind of not susceptible to needing that information beginning or having to rebuild it if I don't have that information at the beginning. So this material thickness value that I've put in is, I would say, the thing I use absolutely the most in in parameterization in Fusion. So in this case, I've set the material thickness on all this to be 1.25. But if I wanted this to be 2 inches, I could simply change to 2 inches. And you can see now my shelf thickness and upright thickness has updated. But normally it's not a round number like that, right? It would be like, after I get it out of the planer, it's going to be like 2.113 inches, right? And there you go. It's updated. So, and if we hide, or rather isolate here, oh, hit OK. We'll isolate this one component. You can see this bookshelf is put together with sort of blind dados, and all of those, if I go and change parameters, every single one of those is going to update. If I put this back to, say, 1.125 inches, see, they're all going to get smaller. So, and that, man, that just saves you so much time rather than trying to dig around in every little sketch and every little operation that you've done to try and find where you've defined your material thickness, right? So in this case, it's defined in the sketch for both of those guys, but you can also use variables or parameters rather in 3D operations. So for instance, the thickness of an extrusion that you want to make, that can be a parameter. So it's really, really, really powerful for those types of things where it's just like, man, if only I could just change that as many times as I wanted to. Well, you can. And the only thing you're going to have to do at that point is export the new files for Origin to make sure you get the updated drawing onto Origin. But beyond that, it just makes it really simple and straightforward. Otherwise, I would say, like I said, a little bit of a party trick. Does take some amount of thinking and time to set things up, but nice. For instance, the shelf count thing that I set up, it's cool to be able to just change that on the fly and not have to rebuild the model too much. So,
yeah, I want to say thanks for everybody for joining this sessions, and we will see you next time.